On September 22, 1985, 5 men gathered in a private room at New York's Plaza Hotel. The finance ministers of the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and Britain arrived with a single shared problem. The American dollar had grown dangerously strong. Since 1980, it had climbed nearly 50%, and American factories were bleeding. Cars from Toyota, televisions from Sony, and machine tools from Osaka flooded into the country, while Detroit and Pittsburgh laid off workers. The United States trade deficit had ballooned past $100 billion, and a large share of that gap pointed directly at Japan. Treasury Secretary James Baker wanted a fix that avoided open trade war. The solution was elegant and dangerous. Instead of raising tariffs, the governments would coordinate to drive the dollar down and push other currencies up. The Japanese yen sat near 240 to the dollar that morning. Japan's finance minister, Noboru Takeshita, agreed to let it rise, believing a stronger yen was manageable, and that cooperation with Washington served Tokyo's long-term interests. The agreement was announced that Sunday, and it was deliberate in every word. Central banks would sell dollars in concert, talking the currency lower and backing their words with reserves. This was not a market accident. It was engineered policy. 5 governments reaching into the world's largest market to reset the price of money itself. For Washington, it promised relief for exporters and a quieter political season. For Japan, it seemed a reasonable concession from a nation riding an unstoppable economic miracle, an economy that had risen from wartime ruins to challenge America for industrial supremacy. Takeshita returned to Tokyo confident. The Bank of Japan understood the risk that a rising yen would hurt exporters, but few imagined the scale of what was coming. The men shook hands and left the plaza, believing they had managed the global economy with surgical precision. What they had actually done was pull a lever whose full force no one could measure. Within days, the currency markets responded, and the yen began a climb that would not stop where anyone expected. The flight was about to begin, and it would move faster than any of them had planned. The markets reacted almost instantly. Within days of the Plaza announcement, the yen jumped from 240 to 230 against the dollar. But that was only the start. Traders sensed that 5 governments were committed to a one-way move, and they piled in behind it. By the end of 1985, the yen had reached 200. By the summer of 1986, it broke through 160. In under a year, the Japanese currency had strengthened by roughly 40%, far beyond anything the ministers at the Plaza had discussed. For Japan's exporters, this was a catastrophe unfolding in real time. A car that earned a set price in dollars now brought home far fewer yen. Toyota, Nissan, and the great electronics firms watched their profit margins evaporate. A product priced to compete in 1985 was suddenly 40% more expensive on American shelves without a single change to the factory floor. Economists in Tokyo coined a grim new word, endaka, the pain of the strong yen. Manufacturing regions felt it first. Small suppliers in the industrial belts around Nagoya and Osaka saw orders canceled. Factories cut shifts. The powerful export machine that had defined the Japanese economy for a generation was seizing up, and the fear spread quickly through the government and the press. Talk of recession dominated headlines. The Ministry of Finance faced mounting political pressure to protect jobs and shield the industrial base that had carried the post-war miracle. Business leaders demanded relief. Something had to cushion the blow of a currency that had risen too far, too fast. The pressure landed squarely on one institution, the Bank of Japan. If the yen could not be pushed back down without breaking the Plaza Agreement, then the central bank would have to stimulate the domestic economy to replace the lost export demand. The obvious tool was interest rates. Cut the cost of borrowing, the thinking went, and Japanese consumers and companies would spend and invest at home, filling the hole left by struggling exporters. It seemed responsible, even necessary. But the choice to flood a wounded economy with cheap credit would set in motion the most spectacular financial bubble the modern world had ever seen. The Bank of Japan began cutting, From a rate of 5% in early 1986, the central bank moved steadily downward through the year. Cut followed cut, as officials tried to offset the damage from the soaring yen. By February 1987, the official discount rate reached 2.5%, the lowest level in the Bank of Japan's history and among the lowest anywhere in the developed world. This was money made astonishingly cheap, and the bank held that rate steady for more than 2 years, far longer than the crisis warranted, partly because inflation stayed low, and partly because Japan had promised its Plaza partners it would stimulate domestic demand rather than lean on exports. The result was a flood of credit, unlike anything Japan had experienced. Banks, awash in funds and eager to lend, went looking for borrowers. But here the plan met an unexpected wall. The strong yen meant that traditional export investment offered poor returns. Building another factory to sell overseas made little sense when the currency was crushing overseas profits. So the money went hunting for somewhere else to grow. It found 2 destinations: land and shares. Japanese banks began lending aggressively against real estate, accepting property as collateral and extending ever larger loans as prices rose. Corporations discovered they could borrow cheaply and pour the proceeds into the stock market and into land, a practice called Zytec, financial engineering that often earned companies more than their actual businesses. A steel maker could make more money speculating than making steel. The logic became self-reinforcing. Cheap credit pushed up asset prices. Rising asset prices increased the value of collateral. Higher collateral justified even larger loans, which pushed prices higher still. Every part of the machine fed the next. Households, corporations, and banks were swept into the same rising current. The Bank of Japan had intended to rescue a wounded export economy. Instead, it had lit the fuse on a speculative explosion, and the central bank was slow to recognize the danger. Money that could find no productive home was rushing into the 2 markets least able to absorb it safely. Nowhere would that rush prove more spectacular or more delusional than in the price of Japanese land. By the late 1980s, Japanese land prices had entered a realm that defied all reason. Tokyo led the surge. Commercial property in the Ginza district reached prices so extreme that a single square meter could cost more than 30 million yen. Across the 6 major cities, land values more than tripled between 1985 and 1990. The numbers produced comparisons that became legend. It was said that the grounds of the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo were worth more than all the real estate in the state of California. The land beneath Japan, a nation smaller than the American state of Montana, was calculated to be worth roughly 4 times the value of all land in the entire United States. These figures seemed absurd, and yet the market treated them as sober fact. Behind the mania lay a cultural conviction that ran deep. In crowded, mountainous Japan, where flat, buildable land was genuinely scarce, people had long believed that property prices simply could not fall. This faith had a name in the phrase that land was safe, a myth of permanently rising value. Banks believed it too. They lent against land with reckless confidence, assuming collateral would only appreciate. If a borrower could not repay, the bank reasoned, the underlying property would be worth more anyway. That assumption drove a lending frenzy. Ordinary families took on enormous mortgages, some stretching across generations, 100-year loans that a father would pass to his son. Companies bought land not to use but to hold, watching it rise. Speculators borrowed against one plot to buy another, building towers of debt on the single belief that the ground would never lose value. The banking system tied its entire fortune to this conviction, pumping the cheap money of the 2.5% era straight into dirt. Every loan pushed prices higher, and every higher price justified the next loan. It was a perfect machine for inflating value, spinning faster each month. And as fortunes multiplied on paper, the same intoxicating certainty spread to another market entirely, where a single number climbed toward a peak that Japan believed would never end. The Tokyo Stock Exchange became the second engine of the boom, and it roared. The Nikkei 225 index, which stood near 13,000 in 1985, began a relentless ascent. As cheap credit poured into shares and corporate Zytec speculation multiplied, the index doubled, then climbed higher still. By the end of the decade, the Nikkei had passed 30,000 and kept rising, defying every warning that valuations had lost touch with reality. Japanese stocks traded at price-to-earnings ratios that dwarfed anything on Wall Street, but few cared. The market seemed to obey its own physics. On December 29, 1989, the last trading day of the decade, the Nikkei 225 closed at 38,915, its all-time peak. Japan's stock market was now worth more than any other on Earth, its listed companies valued at nearly half the entire world's equity. The euphoria spilled far beyond the exchange floor. Flush with wealth, both real and imagined, Japanese money surged across the globe on a spending spree that stunned the world. Mitsubishi Estate bought a controlling stake in New York's Rockefeller Center. Sony acquired Columbia Pictures. Japanese buyers snapped up the Pebble Beach Golf Resort in California, impressionist paintings at record auction prices, and trophy real estate from Honolulu to London. A businessman paid $82 million for a single Van Gogh. Tokyo nightclubs sold gold flakes and cocktails. Companies handed out lavish bonuses, and confidence hardened into national certainty. Books appeared explaining why Japan would soon overtake the United States as the world's dominant economy. American commentators wrote anxiously about a coming Japanese century. Inside Japan, an entire generation had known only rising prices, expanding fortunes, and the sense that their nation had unlocked a permanent formula for wealth. The land could not fall. The market could not fall. The miracle would not end. But 38,915 was not a beginning, it was a summit. At the very moment the nation felt most invincible, a new figure had taken command of the Bank of Japan, a man who looked at the towering markets and saw not triumph, but a dangerous bubble that had to be destroyed. His hand was already reaching for the brake. On December 17, 1989, a new man took the helm of the Bank of Japan. Yasushi Miyano had watched the bubble swell with something close to disgust. To him, soaring land prices were not prosperity, but rot, a moral injury to the salaryman who could no longer dream of owning a home. Within 8 days of his appointment, the Nikkei touched its all-time peak. Miyano did not celebrate. He reached for the brake, and he pulled hard. His predecessor had left the discount rate at 2.5%, the record low that fueled the mania. Miyano reversed course with a speed that stunned the markets. He raised the rate to 3.25% in December 1989, then to 4.25% in March 1990, then to 5.25% in August, and finally to 6% by the end of that month. In 9 months, the cost of money more than doubled, but the interest rate was only half the weapon. In March 1990, the Ministry of Finance issued a directive that would prove decisive. Banks were ordered to cap the growth of their real estate lending to the pace of their overall lending. The spigot that had drowned Tokyo in credit was suddenly clamped shut. The developers who had borrowed against ever-rising land, the speculators rolling loans into fresh purchases, the corporations playing the stock market with borrowed billions, all of them found the money gone. Miyano believed he was performing a controlled demolition, letting air out of the bubble gently, restoring sanity without catastrophe. He was celebrated in the press as the man brave enough to spoil the party. Ordinary Japanese, priced out of their own cities, quietly cheered him on. What no one understood was how much of the entire economy now rested on the assumption that prices only rose. Remove that single belief, and the arithmetic underneath collapsed. Land pledged as collateral was worth less than the loans it secured. Stocks bought on margin turned toxic overnight. Miyano had aimed to release the pressure. Instead, he had struck the first crack in a dam holding back trillions of yen, and the flood was about to break loose. The Nikkei began falling in the first trading days of 1990, and it did not stop. By October, the index had shed nearly half its value, dropping below 20,000 from its 38,915 peak. Investors kept waiting for the rebound that had always come before. This time it never arrived. By 1992, the Nikkei touched 14,000, a loss of more than 60%, wiping out over $2 trillion in paper wealth. Land followed, only slower and more brutally. Commercial property in Japan's 6 largest cities eventually fell by roughly 87% from its peak. The Imperial Palace grounds no longer outvalued California. They no longer outvalued much of anything. Families who had bought at the top owed sums they could never repay against homes worth a fraction of the debt. The damage concentrated in the banks. Japanese lenders had extended credit against collateral that was now vaporizing. As borrowers defaulted, the banks buried the losses rather than admit them. Regulators looked away. Loans that should have been written off were quietly rolled over, kept alive on paper. The result was a landscape of zombie companies. Firms that were economically dead, but financially undead, servicing debt they could never clear, occupying capital and market space that healthier businesses needed. Estimates of the bad loans clogging the system climbed relentlessly, eventually reaching figures near $1 trillion. Because the banks refused to recognize the losses, they could not lend freely to anyone else. Credit ceased. Investment froze. The engine that had roared for 4 decades sputtered and stalled. The human toll spread outward. Construction firms failed. The great securities houses staggered. In 1997, Yamaichi Securities, a 100-year-old pillar, collapsed, its president bowing in tears before the cameras. Hokkaido Takushoku Bank went under the same year. The famed lifetime employment promise began to fracture, and a generation of graduates found no doors open. Japan had not merely lost money, it had lost its confidence, its momentum, and its faith in the future. The controlled demolition had become an uncontrolled collapse. And as the 1990s wore on, the country discovered that the wreckage would not clear in a year, or 5, or even 10. The 1990s came to be called the lost decade. Then the 2000s arrived, and the name had to be revised. Japan had entered a trap from which no policy tool seemed able to free it. The trap of deflation, where prices fall, and falling prices teach everyone to wait. Why spend today when goods will be cheaper tomorrow? Why invest when returns keep shrinking? Consumers hoarded cash. Companies paid down debt instead of expanding. This behavior was rational for each person and ruinous for the whole. Consumer prices drifted downward for years, an affliction almost unknown in modern advanced economies. The government fought back with the largest weapons it had. Through the 1990s, Tokyo launched stimulus package after stimulus package, pouring trillions of yen into roads, bridges, and dams, some leading nowhere, monuments to spending for its own sake. Public debt ballooned past 100% of GDP, then past 200%, the highest in the developed world. The Bank of Japan cut interest rates to 0 by 1999 and pioneered a strange new experiment called quantitative easing. Growth barely stirred. Beneath the economics lay a demographic time bomb. Japan's birth rate had fallen below replacement, and its population began aging faster than any nation in history. Fewer workers, more retirees, shrinking demand. The arithmetic of stagnation compounded year after year. A generation of young people, the so-called lost generation, entered a job market with no permanent positions and never fully recovered their footing. The psychological scar ran deepest of all. This was the nation that had terrified American executives in the 1980s. The country expected to overtake the United States. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. The swagger vanished, replaced by caution, thrift, and a pervasive sense of diminished horizons. GDP that had grown at miracle rates now crawled near zero for decades. By the 2010s, economists spoke not of a lost decade, but of lost decades, plural, 30 years in which the world's second-largest economy simply failed to grow. The question that haunted every central banker studying Japan was chillingly simple. How did a triumph become a tomb, and could it happen to them? The Plaza Accord had a narrow, reasonable goal: rebalance global trade by weakening an overvalued dollar. On that measure, it worked. The dollar fell, the yen soared, and the imbalances eased. Yet the deal set in motion a chain no one at the Plaza Hotel intended: a strong yen, a frightened Bank of Japan, a flood of cheap credit, and a bubble that, when it burst, cost Japan 30 years. The lesson that central banks drew was not about currencies alone. It was about what happens when monetary policy is used to solve one problem and blindly creates another. Japan cut rates to soften the pain of a rising yen. That easy money never reached the productive economy it was meant to help. Instead, it rushed into land and shares, inflating asset prices while consumer prices stayed calm, hiding the danger in plain sight. That is the trap that now stalks every modern central banker. When policymakers watch only inflation figures, an asset bubble can grow unseen, financed by borrowing, cheered as prosperity. And when the bubble bursts, the debt remains, poisoning the banks and freezing the economy for a generation. Alan Greenspan studied Japan. Ben Bernanke studied Japan. After 2008, the entire developed world found itself using tools Japan invented: zero rates, quantitative easing, and discovered how hard it is to escape once you enter. Japan's mistakes compounded the wound: banks that hid their losses, regulators who looked away, stimulus that built bridges to nowhere, while zombie firms drained the system's strength. The delay in facing reality turned a crash into a chronic condition. Stand today before the towers of Tokyo, the glass and steel raised in the euphoric 1980s, monuments to money that seemed infinite. They still gleam, but their true value was never fully restored, and the debt behind them lingers in the national ledger decades later. They are the lesson, priced in glass. The deal at the Plaza was signed to fix a currency. What it exposed was a deeper danger no signature could contain: weaken a currency, unleash easy credit, and let a nation believe prices only rise. And this is the verdict history records. Cheap money built a 30-year trap.